November 12, 1942, near Lyon, Vichy France. The Gestapo checkpoint at the railway station. Virginia Hall stepped out of the restroom with a leather satchel pressed against her hip. Inside, 47 names. If they searched that bag, everyone on the list would be dead by dawn. 3 officers stood at the platform entrance, checking papers. She adjusted her worn scarf, favored her left leg with the exaggerated limp she'd perfected, and walked straight toward them. The wooden prosthetic beneath her skirt, Cuthbert, she called it, scraped faintly against the pavement. One officer glanced at her, noted the limp, waved her through without asking for papers. She was the American spy the Nazis wanted more than any other operative in France. They had her photograph. They knew her real name. Gestapo headquarters kept a file labeled "The Limping Lady" with standing orders. Capture alive if possible, shoot on sight if necessary. What they did not understand was that the wooden leg was not her weakness. It was her camouflage. The limp made her invisible. And for 2 years, while the Gestapo tore through France hunting for a dangerous Allied agent, Virginia Hall walked past their checkpoints in broad daylight, carrying sabotage plans and stolen intelligence under a peasant woman's shawl. This is the story of how a woman the U.S. State Department once rejected as unsuitable for foreign service became the most effective Allied operative in occupied France. Virginia Hall was born in Baltimore in 1906, the daughter of a prosperous family that expected her to marry well and host dinner parties. Instead, she studied languages in Europe, mastered French, German, and Italian, and applied repeatedly to join the U.S. Foreign Service. They turned her down every time. Then, in 1933, while hunting in Turkey, her shotgun discharged. The blast tore through her left foot. Gangrene set in. Surgeons amputated below the knee. She was 27 years old. The State Department informed her that the amputation made her ineligible for diplomatic work. No exceptions. Virginia Hall learned to walk on a wooden prosthetic, took low-level embassy posts across Europe, and when war broke out in 1939, she volunteered as an ambulance driver for the French army. When France fell in June 1940, she made her way to London. The Americans still would not give her a real posting, so she walked into the offices of the British Special Operations Executive and offered her services. One interviewer asked if she could handle field work. Virginia Hall stood, walked across the room without a cane, and said she could hike 20 miles a day if needed. The SOE hired her in April 1941. 3 months later, she was in Vichy France, preparing to build a resistance network from scratch. Lyon, in the autumn of 1941, was a city holding its breath. Technically part of unoccupied Vichy France, it sat on the edge of the demarcation line, separating Marshal Pétain's collaborationist government from the German-occupied north. The city was crawling with Gestapo informants, Vichy police, and refugees desperate enough to sell information for a meal. Setting up a spy network here was like planting explosives in a room full of people holding lit matches. Virginia Hall rented a small apartment above a tailor's shop. She told neighbors she was a journalist writing human interest stories about daily life under occupation. She limped to cafes with a notebook, asked harmless questions about rationing and curfews, and quietly identified which shopkeepers, priests, and railway clerks might be willing to pass messages or hide fugitives. Her limp and her gender made her seem irrelevant, and her patience, her willingness to spend months building trust before asking anyone to risk their life, made her network unbreakable. By the winter of 1941, Hall was running 12 active resistance contacts and coordinating the exfiltration of Allied airmen shot down over France. She set up safe houses in farmhouses and convents. She bribed railway workers to delay German troop trains. She recruited a prostitute who worked near Gestapo headquarters to eavesdrop on officers' conversations. She sent coded messages to London via a black market radio operator who hid his transmitter in a winemaker's cellar. And she did all of this while limping through the streets of Lyon with Cuthbert strapped to her leg, looking like someone's aging aunt who could barely manage the stairs. The Gestapo knew a major Allied network was operating in Lyon. They ran raids, arrested suspects, interrogated informants. They never suspected the quiet American woman with the walking stick. But Virginia Hall was not invincible. She was alone. She had no backup team, no extraction plan, no margin for error. Every arrest in her network meant interrogations, and interrogations meant someone might break under torture. Every safe house she used was a potential trap. Every courier who carried her messages could be stopped at a checkpoint and searched. She lived in a state of permanent, low-grade terror, knowing that one mistake, a misplaced name, a suspicious landlord, a botched code, could unravel everything she had built. In early 1942, the pressure intensified. The Gestapo arrested one of her couriers, a young man named Germain, who had been ferrying messages between Lyon and Marseille. Under interrogation, Germain gave up a safe house address. Hall moved 17 people out of that safe house in less than 4 hours, relocating them to farms and attics across the countryside. She burned her contact lists and changed her own lodgings 3 times in a week. Then came the order that changed everything. In November 1942, the demarcation line dissolved. Germany invaded southern France. Vichy's pretense of independence vanished overnight. The Gestapo flooded Lyon, and Klaus Barbie, the infamous Butcher of Lyon, arrived to hunt down resistant cells. Virginia Hall's network was at the top of his list. Within days, a resistance fighter she had worked with was arrested and tortured. The man did not break, but the Gestapo now had a description. An American woman, late 30s, slight limp, fluent French. Posters went up. Wanted. The Limping lady. Reward for information. For the first time, she realized the hunters now knew exactly who they were chasing. London sent an urgent message: evacuate immediately. Hall considered her options. The northern escape routes were cut off. The only way out was south, over the Pyrenees into Spain, a mountain crossing that, in winter, killed experienced climbers. Attempting it with a wooden leg was close to suicidal. She decided to go. If she failed, 47 names would die with her on that mountain. On November 20th, 1942, Virginia Hall left Lyon on foot, traveling with a small group of refugees heading for the Spanish border. They moved at night, sleeping in barns and abandoned shepherds' huts. Hall told no one about Cuthbert. She wrapped the prosthetic in extra wool socks to muffle the sound and kept walking. Her stump blistered and bled. She kept walking. When the group reached the foothills of the Pyrenees, a guide told her the crossing was impossible in her condition. Hall said she would try anyway. The climb took 3 days. The route led through snow and ice at over 7,000 feet. Hall's wooden leg slipped on frozen scree, jammed between rocks, refused to bend at the ankle when she needed to scramble over boulders. She fell repeatedly, once tumbling 10 feet down an icy slope before catching herself on an outcrop. Each time, she hauled herself upright, adjusted Cuthbert's straps against her raw, bleeding stump, and kept climbing. The cold was merciless. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Hall's companions built small fires in the lee of rock formations. Hall wrapped herself in every layer she had and slept sitting upright, because lying down made her stump throb unbearably. At one point, frostbite began creeping into her toes, the real ones on her right foot. She massaged them back to feeling and kept moving. On the second day, Cuthbert's leather straps began to fray from the constant friction against ice. Hall used strips torn from her undershirt to reinforce them. That night, she radioed London to say Cuthbert was giving her trouble. The radio operator, not knowing Cuthbert was her prosthetic, replied, "If Cuthbert is giving you trouble, have him eliminated." Hall laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the frozen rocks. She was 46 years old, climbing a mountain that killed young men in their prime, with a wooden leg held together by improvised bandages, and London thought Cuthbert was a troublesome guide. She kept climbing. On the third day, the group crested the final ridge. Spain lay below, brown and barren and safe. Hall descended the southern slope on her hands and knees, dragging Cuthbert behind her when the angle was too steep to walk. By the time she reached the valley floor, her hands were cut to ribbons, her stump was a mass of infected blisters, and she could barely stand. Spanish border guards arrested her as an illegal entrant and held her in a detention camp for 6 weeks before the British Embassy secured her release. By the time she reached London in early 1943, frostbite had damaged her stump so badly that she needed a new prosthetic fitted. London wanted to give her a desk job. Hall said no. She wanted to go back to France. The British SOE refused. Her face was too well known. The Gestapo had circulated her photograph to every checkpoint in southern France. Sending her back would be a death sentence. So Virginia Hall went to the Americans. The Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, was desperate for experienced field operatives. They asked if she could return to France under deep cover. Hall said yes. She would need a new identity, a new disguise, and a new cover story. The OSS gave her all three. In March 1944, Virginia Hall returned to France via a nighttime beach landing in Brittany. She was no longer a journalist. She was now Marcel Montagne, an elderly peasant woman from the Ardennes, displaced by bombing. She wore shapeless farm dresses, thick stockings, and a gray wig. She stooped when she walked, making her limp look like the natural gait of an arthritic old woman. She carried forged identity papers identifying her as 63 years old. The disguise worked. German patrols checked her papers at roadblocks and waved her through. Vichy police questioned her in villages and let her go. She was invisible again, not because they did not see her, but because they saw exactly what they expected to see. An old, tired woman with bad legs and no value to anyone. Under this cover, Hall moved through the French countryside in the months before D-Day, coordinating resistance groups, identifying sabotage targets, and preparing guerrilla cells for the Allied invasion. She set up a radio post in a farmhouse near Le Puy and transmitted intelligence reports to London every night. She organized railway demolitions, cutting German supply lines. She trained resistance fighters in weapons use and guerrilla tactics, and she did it all while maintaining the persona of Marcel Montagne, the harmless old woman who milked cows and complained about rationing. In June 1944, after Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hall's network carried out coordinated attacks across central France. Her teams destroyed bridges, derailed troop trains, ambushed German convoys. The Wehrmacht's 7th Army, trying to move north to reinforce the front, found itself paralyzed by sabotage in regions where the Germans thought there was no serious resistance. One German report from that summer, captured after the war, described intense guerrilla activity led by an unidentified coordinator in the Haute-Loire region. The report noted that the coordinator used an extensive network of rural informants and moved frequently, making capture difficult. It did not mention that the coordinator was a woman with a wooden leg who the Gestapo had been hunting for 3 years. The war ended in May 1945. Virginia Hall returned to the United States and received the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman to be so honored during World War II. President Truman offered to present the medal in a public ceremony. Hall declined. She did not want publicity. She wanted to keep working. The newly formed CIA hired her in 1947. She spent the next 14 years in intelligence work, much of it behind a desk, analyzing reports and training new officers. She never went into the field again. The work was classified and essential, but there were costs no medal could address. Hall rarely spoke about the war, even to her husband. Friends noticed she would sometimes stop mid-conversation, her eyes distant, as if she were back in a lion safe house, listening for boots on the stairs. The nightmares came irregularly, but intensely. Dreams of checkpoints, of names in satchels, of frozen mountains. Hall retired in 1966 at the age of 60 and moved to a farm in Maryland, where she lived quietly until her death in 1982. For decades, her wartime service remained largely unknown outside intelligence circles. The CIA did not declassify details of her missions until the 1980s. By then, most of the resistance fighters she had worked with were dead, and the networks she had built were erased from official histories. France honored her with the Croix de Guerre, but there were no statues, no memorials, no films. The Limping lady, who the Gestapo wanted more than almost any other agent in Europe, faded into obscurity. Why? Partly because Hall herself avoided recognition, but also because the men who wrote the post-war histories of espionage did not know what to do with a woman who did not fit the archetype of the glamorous spy. Virginia Hall was not beautiful, not charming, not seductive. She was methodical, patient, and relentless. She built networks by listening, not by flirting. She survived by being underestimated, not by being irresistible. And when the war ended, the same institutions that had once rejected her as unsuitable quietly filed her story away, as if a woman with a wooden leg could not possibly have been that important. But she was. Virginia Hall ran the longest operating Allied intelligence network in France. She coordinated more than 100 resistance fighters. She provided critical intelligence for the D-Day invasion. And she did it all while the Gestapo was actively hunting her, while her own government doubted her, and while every checkpoint she passed through assumed she was too old, too crippled, and too harmless to matter. She used their assumptions as camouflage, and when they finally realized who she was, it was too late. She was already gone, limping over a frozen mountain pass in the middle of winter, carrying stolen Nazi codes under her coat, ready to come back and do it all over again. What does it mean to be invisible by choice? Virginia Hall knew. She turned rejection into resilience, disability into disguise, and underestimation into operational advantage. She was hunted by one of the most efficient security apparatuses in history, and she stayed free by walking slowly, speaking softly, and never letting anyone see the steel underneath the limp. How many others like her existed? People whose courage depended on being overlooked, whose survival required them to be dismissed, and how many of their stories were never told because the world was too busy looking for heroes who looked the part.